So, Peter Fabiano was a former U.S. Marine, but was working as a truck driver when he had met his future wife, Betty, in the late 1940s. Disclaimer, it was the 1940s, so it's very difficult to find a lot of information on this, and the media was incredibly hush-hush, which we will get into why later. But Betty and Peter fell in love, and they were married and living in Kingston, New York. Betty had 2 children from a previous marriage, but their blended family had actually ended up relocating to Los Angeles in 1956, where they had then decided to open up 2 beauty shops. Fun. Betty helped manage the store alongside Peter, but of course they needed help to run the entire establishments, so they had hired on some staff, and one of those staff members was named Joan Rabel. Could be Rebel, could be Rabel, for my luck. Now, Joan was previously a freelance photographer who spent time taking writing classes at the University of Honolulu in the late 1940s. So, what was she doing in a beauty parlor? I don't know. They never specify. But she was a divorcee from Philadelphia and was just looking for work in the city, I guess. But regardless, she ended up being one of the few that was hired, and she developed a very close working relationship to Peter and Betty, and particularly became very close with Betty. After working there for however long, it doesn't actually specify timelines quite well, Betty and Peter had had a few hiccups in their relationship. Things were not going so well. So Betty, who was very close with Joan, had ended up actually leaving her home with Peter. She even took the children, and they had all lived with Joan. Now, it isn't clear what her relationship with Joan was, but it's kind of clear. The media at the time said that Betty and Joan had an abnormal relationship, so I'm thinking they were a little bit of lovers. Most people believe so, at least. So Betty had left Peter. They were going through a tough time. She had leaned on Joan quite a bit, and it doesn't actually say how long she lived with Joan, but it's implied that quite a bit, and they had a very intense relationship. But Betty and Peter ended up trying to reconcile their relationship. So, over the course of 3 months, Joan had manipulated and talked Goldine into planning and murdering Peter. Very intense. She gave Goldine money so that she could purchase a weapon and bullets, and Joan had even planned on borrowing one of her close friend's car to use as a getaway vehicle. So Joan gave her money, but Goldine was still the one that actively went in and purchased the weapon and that type of thing. And on Halloween night, their plan was to commence. So the night of the murder, Joan had borrowed her friend's car and left her vehicle in her driveway. Now she did so that her neighbors, should they be questioned, be able to back Joan up that no, she was at home all night, her vehicle was there, she was inside, the lights were on. Joan had then went out and picked up costumes for herself and Goldine to wear, so they dressed up for the night so that they were unrecognizable. So they wore domino masks. This one fits so tight on my face I could not wear it. Khaki large jackets, bright red gloves, and a heavy face of makeup. There it is. That's why I look so ridiculous. And also, what are you supposed to be on Halloween dressed as this? It's a murderer. There's no rhyme or reason here. If I'm coming to your door, anyway. So the two had dressed up and went outside of Peter's home. Now they had parked just a little bit down the road so that they could see the home, but were hopefully in their mind a good enough distance that they shouldn't seem suspicious, and even if he happened to take a look, he would not recognize any of the women in the car, particularly Joan. Meanwhile, in the home, Peter, Betty, and Betty's daughter, Judy, were home, and they were just handing out candy to trick-or-treaters and then heading off to bed. Now, the two outside had waited for all of the lights to turn off in the home. So they'd watch the living room light go off, the master bedroom light go off, and then Joan, as she watched the final light go off, turned to Goldine and said, "All right, go do it." So Goldine had approached the home and rang the doorbell, while Joan had slightly driven forward so that she could prep for a speedy getaway. And when Goldine had rang the doorbell, it was just a little past 11 o'clock. Peter had went downstairs to open the door, and imagining that it was just a very late trick-or-treater, I think the latest I've ever gotten a treater was maybe 9:30, and even then I thought that was pretty late, so 11, pretty pushing it, should it be a kid. So as Peter walked downstairs, he'd opened the door and actually said to Goldine, "It's a little late for this, isn't it?" To which Goldine replied in the lowest voice that she could, "No." She was holding a brown paper bag, supposedly for treats, that actually concealed the weapon. Just after she spoke, she'd raised the bag, still hiding the gun, and it shot at Peter, knocking him down. Peter had fallen to the ground, and Goldine had ran to the car. Joan kissed her passionately and whispered, "Thank you," before speeding off. Now the two have gotten away, and Betty and Judy are still at home. And they're severely startled and confused. "I heard a gunshot. What's going on?" So Betty actually had went downstairs to see what had happened and had seen her newly reconciled lover lying on the floor, covered in blood, with a bullet that actually was lodged just below his heart. So Judy, Betty's daughter, had phoned the police as her mother attended to her husband. Peter was then rushed to a nearby hospital, but had died shortly after arriving. After all of this, the police had came to speak with Betty, but unfortunately she was too hysterical, too overwhelmed, too upset, struggling, and was just not helpful. So they'd actually ended up sedating her to calm her down. Meanwhile, wish it was easier, but what can you do? So Ed endured a very difficult childhood. His father was an alcoholic and his mother was incredibly verbally abusive towards him. He nevertheless had actually idolized his mother, a fact that always concerned his elderly brother Henry, whom occasionally had confronted her in Ed's presence. His teachers and classmates in elementary school recall him being quite shy, but having very strange mannerisms, such as bursting out in fits of laughter, apparently just at his own internal monologue. I mean, I've done that before, like with a memory, but no, his was a bit different. His school had blamed his mother, who punished him when he tried to make friends. Because of that, for most of his childhood, he was relatively alone and in solitary because she literally would not allow him to have friends, which is so important developmentally, you know. Anyway, aside from penalizing his social life, his mother would confine Ed and his brother Henry to their farm. She would often read to them from the Bible and preach that the world was inherently evil, that all women were prostitutes, and that drinking and immortality were instruments of the devil. I mean, okay, apparently since I'm a woman, I'm a prostitute anyway. I'm drinking, so I'm so evil, right? I don't know. That is a bizarre way to look at things, for sure. So when Ed was 38 years old, him and his brother Henry were working in the fields on their farm. They were burning away marsh vegetation, which is a common practice. But when the fire got out of hand and spread, the fire department had needed to be called. After the firefighters had come and gone and the fires were dealt with, Ed had reported his brother was missing. This was afterwards. I feel like if my vegetation was that on fire that I needed to call the department, I'd also be looking for my sibling. I wouldn't wait for them to leave and then be like, oh, still can't find him. I'd be like, guys, please look out for him. But it's Ed Gein, right? So sure enough, his brother Henry had died. And although Ed had reported his brother missing to the police, he was able to lead them directly to where his body was when they arrived. So, hey, he's missing. Oh, you're here finally. Yeah, he's over here. That's suspicious, but okay. So his body was found face down in the marsh, and he had died from asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed out, although authorities had realized that Henry was dead before the fire was out of hand, at least, and that he'd had a bunch of bruises all over his head. So, fires were not out of control, and he was seemingly beat, but despite all of that, the death was ruled an accident. The authorities did suspect Ed for killing his brother, but there was not enough evidence at the time to really do anything about it. So, yeah, total accident, right? The fire definitely wasn't a cover-up for sure. No, it was an accident. But I mean, their hands were kind of tied. So after his brother's death, soon had come the death of his mother in 1945, which afterwards made him like a virtual hermit. Like, he did not see people, he didn't do anything, and his behavior got much worse. He'd ended up boarding up areas of the house, preserving them as a sort of shrine. He'd renovated it, is what he'd called it, like the farmhouse, but in a way that literally any room that his mother had actually used, he would just put up wooden boards so that they were untouched and remained exactly the way they were and the way that she would use them. It's kind of Norman Batesy, you know, very, yeah, a little crazy. The only thing that he'd actually lived out of in the house absolutely loved that show. It was so good. I was a big fan. Anyway, so the police entered the home. Sorry for the segue. I just really went off the rails there, hey? I haven't done that in so long. I used to every video. Sorry. So, Ed Gein's home was filled with human body parts. There was countless bones, both whole and fragmented, skulls impaled on his bedposts, and bowls and kitchen utensils made from skulls. Worse than the bones that were found, however, were the household items that were made from human skin. Authorities found chairs upholstered in human skin, a waste basket made of human skin, leggings made from human skin, masks that were made from people's faces that he had basically cut off, a belt made of nipples, a pair of lips being used as a window shade drawstring, a corset made from a female torso, and a lampshade made from a human's face. That is so disgusting. Imagine how would you be able to comprehend what you were actually looking at? If you entered that home, you arrested him, you go in to go and check on things. Not only would I not be able to register what it was I was seeing, I can't even imagine the smell that would accompany that, the smell that would accompany that. I cannot imagine that. So, along with these skin items, police found various dismembered body parts, including fingernails, 4 noses, and the genitals of 9 different women. Yeah. Bernice Warden's body was found as well, decapitated. Her head had been hung in a burlap sack, and her heart was hanging in a plastic bag near the stove. Oh my god. You can see me internally cringing. Her body had been strung up, upside down, and gutted like a deer, similar to how you would, yeah. Alright. Police also found the remains of another woman, Mary Hogan, equally as dismembered. Ugh. When questioned, Ed Gein folded immediately. He told the police that he had made at least 40 different visits to 3 local graveyards to exhume bodies. He claimed that he had done so in a dazed-like state. In addition to his methods, Ed also revealed his motives. He told authorities that soon after his mother's death, he began to create a woman's suit so that he could literally become his mother and crawl into her skin. It's so gross. Okay. Though there were parts of countless bodies found in his home, Ed was arraigned on only 1 count of murder, Bernice Warden's. Ed Gein had pled not guilty, by reasons of insanity. He clearly was, and was declared unfit to stand trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally victims. That's the really, really, really disturbing part that we'll get to later. So, a little bit of background on Joe. Joe was born on March 2nd, 1955, and died on August 5th, 2017. So not too long ago, just a few years ago. He was a big guy. He was a big boy. He was large framed. He was overweight. He was 6'1", just all around big dude. And he actually went by the name Tiny, which is ironic, but I'm assuming that's why they called him that. So in the end, he confessed to killing up to 13 people. However, that was never proven. Only a select few were actually proven, so they don't know if he was, trying to brag in a really sick way, or if he really did kill 13 people and covered it up really well. They never figured that out, but... So let's get into his early life a little bit, his childhood. If you asked Joe, he would say he was neglected as a child, him and his siblings. But if you were to ask his mother, which we'll get into, she kind of had a different story. So Joe's father was an alcoholic, and he was killed in a car accident when Joe was just a little boy. Joe was 6 when he died. So his mother had to raise her 6 kids. They had 6 kids. She had to raise them as a single mother and work and support them and put food on the table and all that. So she worked a lot of double shifts. She worked a couple of different jobs. She was a waitress. She was a barmaid. She drove a food truck at one point. So she did a little bit of everything. Joe claimed that his parents often sent him and his siblings to go stay with another family in what he called a foster-like situation. However, his mother said that that was not true, so we don't really know who to believe here. His mother said, they were somewhat poor. They struggled financially just because there were so many kids and so many people to feed, and it was only one woman working, and she was working more low-paying jobs. So, she said that even though they were somewhat poor, there was always food on the table. The kids never really wanted for anything, and she said that she provided a somewhat, normal life for her kids. She said that, Joe was never neglected, his siblings were never neglected, and she said that the whole foster-like situation of sending Joe to other families' homes was not true. She dismissed that completely. I think I said that. Did I say that twice? I'm sorry if I said that twice. Describing Joe as a kid, she said he got above average grades, he was always well-mannered, he was smart, and she said he had an all-around good childhood that she said she was proud that she kind of provided for him. And then I have a quote from her that said he was smart and had a good childhood. If he was neglected, it was his own fault. It was a pretty good home. That's what she says. At one point too, which is weird, but I guess it's important enough to note, at one point Joe claimed that his mother was dead. She very much was alive. So, it's comments like that kind of make it harder to believe Joe and kind of take the mom's side. But it's very obvious that they didn't have a good relationship. So, not the healthiest home dynamic, I guess. Now, at the age of 18, Joe joined the U.S. Army. This was in 1973. And it was while in the Army that he found drugs and became very addicted to them. Now, again, he and his mother have different stories. According to his mother, he served in Germany. According to Joe, he served a tour in Vietnam, and he said it was there that he discovered drugs and his problem began. However, it was never actually proven that he was in Vietnam. American involvement in Vietnam was actually over at that time, so it doesn't make sense to say that he was in Vietnam, and it makes it very hard to believe that. Obviously, they could go through the paperwork and figure it out, but I didn't find the answer. But again, if American involvement was over at the time, then I'm gonna go
regardless, it was in the army that he discovered drugs and his problem began. And it was also after he joined the army that he and his mother began to drift apart. He rarely contacted her, rarely called back to home to like check in. I have another quote from her that said he just kept drifting further and further away. I think the worst thing that ever happened to him was drugs. It's a sad, sad story. Alright, so now we're gonna go into his young adulthood a little bit. So despite Joe having these drug issues, he actually managed to become a family man. He got married and had a little boy. He also had a steady job. He was a forklift driver, so he held it fine. His co-workers said he was a hard worker and that he was super polite and well-mannered, you know. But despite all this, he and his wife definitely had issues. She was addicted to drugs as well, and they fought a lot. A big part of that was that most of the money he made from his forklift driver job, instead of going to the family to, you know, go towards food and things for their son and all that, he spent it on alcohol, crack, and heroin. And one day, his wife had just had enough, and Joe came home from work to an empty house. His wife had packed a bag, took their son, and left without any warning. And their son would later actually end up in foster care because she also just wasn't fit to raise a son on her own. So his main concern, of course, he became very angry, and this, like, the rage that this sent to him in sets up the rest of his story. So this is where it really begins. So of course he went into a rage, he was angry, and his main concern was that he wanted to find his son, but he knew that he had no chance legally, you know, winning him back because Joe had a criminal record of his own at this point. He had a history of assault and disorderly conduct charges, which, you know, he blamed all that on, like, his traumatic childhood and his drug problem and all that, but at the end of the day, he still had those charges that he earned himself, and he knew that having those under his belt would make it near impossible for him to legally fight to get his son back. So he kind of had to do it on his own. So this is the last thing I'm going to say before I jump into his confession. So his wife ran off, and he had kind of an idea of where to start looking for her. Like I said, she had a drug problem, and there was this bridge that she would go under occasionally and meet other people that she would do her drugs with and stuff like that. And so that is the first place that he went to look. Alright, so there's two different parts. There's like the little confession, which is shorter, and then there's a longer passage that is titled My Story, where he's actually going to talk a little bit about, he's going to set up his story more. So anyway, I'm going to go into this now. So these are all Joe Metheny's words, alright? I literally copied and pasted it. That's why it's got like blue, I don't know if you can see, it's got blue highlighting there. I literally copied and pasted it straight from the website that I was doing my research on. So, alright, here we go. Buckle in, ladies and gentlemen. To start out, I will tell you about myself at the present moment, which is locked up. I am 48 years old. I weigh about 450 pounds, and it's not all fat. I've been locked up for almost 8 years now, but when one has been sentenced to a couple of life without parole sentences, time doesn't matter anymore. I have no problem with being locked up, for no one put me here but myself, and I deserve to be right where I'm at, because I had 12 law-abiding jurors that told me so in a couple different cases. Haha. I was only convicted of 2 murders and 1 kidnapping for the one that got away. I got 50 years for her. The first murder, I was sentenced to life without parole. The second one, they gave me the death penalty. I sat on Maryland was fishing who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the bridge that he went to go look for his wife. And that's what happened. He ended up killing other people that were there. I weighed their bodies down and put them in that river. I showed the police where I put them about 3 years later, but they couldn't find them, so they could not charge me for them. My murder rampage started out as revenge, but ended up as a passion for the taste of blood and the overwhelming sense of power one gets from taking life from another. So he was obviously very proud of everything that he had done. Okay, I gotta hold my phone. My eyes are starting to hurt because the font is super small. Alright, so now we're going into the section titled My Story. It all started back in July of 1994. I was at work. I was a truck driver. I was working overtime this one night. Then I got off and went home as I always did. But when I opened the door and turned on the light, I noticed there was nothing there. My old lady had taken everything, including my son, and left me. Her leaving was not my problem, but she took my 6-year-old son with her. She was a crack addict and a worthless piece of bleep. I would have paid her to get out of my life. All she had to do was take my son over to my mother's house, and she could have had everything else and be gone. I found out about 6 months later she had moved on the other side of town with some butthole that had her out selling her ass for drugs. They got busted for drugs, and they took my son away from them for child neglect and child abuse. I had no chance of going to social services and trying to get my son back due to my criminal record, like I said. So I took it upon myself, with the hatred I had for these two who lost my son, to go looking for them. I found out from someone that they were going under that bridge and getting high with some homeless people who lived under that bridge. I went under there looking for them. They were not there. But the 2 homeless people they got high with were down there. I'm trying to... it's very vulgar, so I'm trying to read around all that. They were passed out on some old stinking mattress, and that's where they were when I left, except they were dead from being chopped up. That same night, I lured the first crack blank down under that bridge. I got her high and was trying to get information out of her about my old lady's whereabouts. She acted like she didn't know, so I beat her and sexually assaulted her, then killed her. I put her in some bushes and went and lured the second girl down there. I did the same to her as the last one, but as I was about to throw her in the bushes with the other one, I noticed an old man down by the river fishing, looking back up at me. I grabbed a steel pipe that was lying by and ran down on him and laid his head wide open. So I put the 2 girls and him in the river and weighed them down with rocks. YouTube's gonna love this video. That was a very busy night for me. 5 murders within about 7 hours. I washed up in that river and cleaned up the crime scene as much as I could, then left. 2.5 weeks later, I was arrested and charged with the murders of the 2 men I chopped up. I spent close to 18 months in Baltimore City Jail waiting to go to trial. The trial lasted 1 week, and it was thrown out of court because of lack of evidence. I was free again. I went back and talked to my old boss into giving me a job at the pallet company. There was a little trailer on the property, so I told my boss to let me stay there and I could keep an eye on the place. He agreed to do this and gave me the keys to the front gate and main building. The company was on a dead-end road and was very isolated. It was perfect for what I wanted it to do. I alerted 2 more crack women up there to my trailer. I killed and butchered their bodies up. I cut the meat up and put it in some Tupperware bowls, then put it in the freezer. I buried the remains in several shallow graves in a little woods behind the company. Over the next couple of weeks, on the weekends, I opened up a little open pit beef stand. It was like a side of the road, little food truck trailer thing. I had real roast beef and pork sandwiches, and why not? They were very good. Okay, I'll read that again, but that doesn't make sense. I had real roast beef and pork sandwiches, And why not? They were very good. The human body tastes were very similar to pork. If you mix it together, no one can tell the difference. You can put 2 and 2 together. He basically combined the pork and the bodies of his victims and fed them to his customers on the side of the road. Everything was going pretty good until I ran out of my special meat. So I lured another woman up to my trailer. I got her in there and started to rip her clothes off and beat her. She was screaming, but there was no one around to hear her except me, and I just kept on laughing at her. I turned around for a split second, and that was my mistake, for she ran out the door before I could get to her. There was an 8-foot chain link fence with barbed wire on top of it around the front of the company. There was a stack of wooden pallets next to the fence about 10 feet high. She scaled those pallets like a monkey and jumped the fence and ran down to the main road where some guy in a pickup truck picked her up and took her to a nearby gas station where they called the cops. Well, I knew the cops were on their way, but I didn't run. I gathered up her clothing, grabbed the keys to the gate, and went out and opened it. As soon as I stepped out the gate, a cop car pulled up, and the cop jumped out and pulled his gun on me and told me to get on the ground. And that is where it all came to an end. They took me down and booked me. She had told them that I said I was going to kill her like the rest, which was true. They had me sitting in a little room down at homicide, drilling me, and damn near kicked my ass, trying to find out what I had done. They pulled me out of city jail every day for 1 month, taking me back and forth between the company and the bridge. I had them going crazy over at the company, digging up the remains of those 2 women down there, because I had their remains buried in seven different holes. The only thing I feel bad about in any of this is I didn't get to murder the 2 people I was really after, and that's my ex-old lady and the man she got hooked up with. Well, that's my story. Horrible, but true. So the next time you're riding down the road and you happen to see an open pit beef stand that you've never seen before, make sure you think about this story before you take a bite of that sandwich. Sometimes you never know who you may be eating. Haha. Disturbing enough for you. Also, my neighbor's landscaper just showed up. I'm sorry if you hear that, but we're kind of almost done, so we'll get through the rest kind of quickly. So, as he said, basically this whole thing started as revenge. You know, his wife sent him into a rage when she took their son, and then he got a little taste of it and became addicted to it. So I have more notes here, but pretty much all of this he just said in his confession. What I am going to do, though, is I'm going to read you the names of the victims, just because I feel like, I don't know, I do it in a way of, like, honoring the victims. Like, I just like to, like, get their story out there and get their names out there. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just have a few of his victims. So there was Kathy Ann Magaziner in 1994. She had been convicted for prostitution and things of the like. He killed her and buried her, and then went back 6 months later and dug up her skeleton and put her head in a box. Not sure why, but that happened. Then the 2 men under the bridge were Randall Brewer and Randy Piker. That was in 1995. Then there was Kimberly Lynn Spicer in 1996, who he stabbed to death. There was Rita Kemper, who was the last one that he tried to lure into his trailer. And she escaped, and she is the reason why he was arrested that day. So, and then the thing is that Joe also asked a friend to help him bury Kimberly Spicer, and his friend was like, what the hell, and also went to police. So either way, he was kind of screwed. So he was arrested for murder in 1996, and the thing is that the police showed up ready for a fight, and Joe went willingly. He told them everything he had done, and like I said, was like genuinely proud of it. So the police didn't even have to fight, he just went willingly. Let's see, and I have another quote from him that said, the words "I'm sorry" will never come out of my mouth, for that would be a lie. So he regretted nothing other than not finding his wife and her boothing. So like he said, he was initially sentenced to death, but it was overturned to 2 life sentences, and he spent the rest of his life in jail. He died at the age of 62 super disturbing, super sick man. And yeah.
So this case is named after the Madrid neighborhood where everything took place, in the 8th apartment in Caluis Marin. I hope I'm saying all of these right. I might not be. But in this apartment, a this is something that really happened, or do you think that, kind of like in the Salem witch trials videos, it was a case of some people in a crowd amping up each other and creating a little psychological hysteria, and it not being, and it being more influence that they were seeing than actual ghosts? Or do you totally believe it was ghosts? Leave a comment below. Either way, the one thing you can take away for sure was Estefania did die for unexplainable reasons, and that alone is quite sad. She was very young, and all of the activities that surrounded it were very suspicious. I don't know. Okay, so is this a real story? And if so, what's it based on? What's it based on, even if it's loosely? Well, honestly, how could it be based on a real story, right? A Nightmare on Elm Street, the plot that follows it is following 4 teenagers living on one street in a fictitious town in Springwood, Ohio, where a monstrous spirit of a child murderer invades kids and kills them in their dreams, and then they die in reality. So the spirit in this movie is a plated
he gets into Glenn's convertible to go to school, and then the top suddenly comes down and locks them in the car as it drives uncontrollably down the street. 3 girls in white dresses playing jump rope are then heard chanting Kruger's nursery rhyme as Marge is grabbed by Kruger through the front door window. Ooh. Creepy, right? Now, the film's villain has to go